Think about the money in your pocket. Think about the massive, interconnected global economy that dictates the rise and fall of nations, the price of your food, and the value of your labor. You are taught that the rules governing this massive financial engine are a uniquely Western invention. You are told to revere the 18th century as the absolute dawn of modern economics. You are taught that in the year 1776, a brilliant Scottish philosopher named Adam Smith sat down and spontaneously invented the concepts of free market capitalism. You are told he was the first human being to understand the mechanism of supply and demand. You are taught that he single-handedly authored the concept of the division of labor, and that his legendary book, The Wealth of Nations, is the undisputed original blueprint for global wealth. We build massive financial institutions, Wall Street empires, and Ivy League universities that worship Adam Smith as the absolute patron saint of the free market. We are taught that without his isolated European genius, the world would still be trapped in the dark ages of feudalism. But the foundational text of global capitalism was not written in 18th century Scotland. The mathematical and philosophical framework that governs the modern free market was written 4 centuries earlier by a brilliant Arab scholar in North Africa. This is the buried record, and today we are peeling back the layers on the Wealth of Nations heist and how the West actually plagiarized the free market. What follows is the story of massive intellectual theft that the modern financial world absolutely does not want you to know. If you are the kind of person who questions the foundational myths of Western supremacy, if you want to know the actual history of how the modern world was built, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. Let us start by looking at the official timeline. The version of economic history you were tested on in school. The narrative of Adam Smith is the most fiercely guarded ideological pillar of the modern Western world. It is the story the West uses to prove its inherent intellectual and economic supremacy over the rest of the globe. The textbook tells you a story of a world trapped in stagnant, oppressive economic systems. For centuries, Europe operated under feudalism, where kings and lords hoarded all the wealth and peasants worked the land for nothing. Then, Europe transitioned into mercantilism, a system where governments heavily controlled all trade, hoarded gold, and believed that in order for one nation to get rich, another nation had to become poor. Then, according to the standard narrative, the European Enlightenment sparks an absolute miracle. In 1776, Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations. He introduces an idea that completely shatters the old world. He introduces the division of labor. Smith famously uses the example of a pin factory. He argues that if one man tries to make a metal pin entirely by himself, drawing the wire, cutting it, sharpening it, attaching the head, he might make 1 pin a day. But if you divide the labor, if one man only draws the wire, another only cuts it, and another only sharpens it, together they can produce thousands of pins a day. Smith claimed this was the absolute secret to creating massive, unprecedented wealth. He then explains the invisible hand of the free market. He argues that supply and demand naturally regulate prices without any need for government interference. If people want more shoes, the price of shoes goes up. This naturally encourages more shoemakers to enter the market, which increases the supply, which eventually brings the price back down. It is a beautiful, self-regulating machine. Finally, Smith argues that heavy taxation and government overreach actually destroy wealth. He posits that lower taxes and free trade stimulate business, creating a richer society overall. The West frames this as the ultimate, undisputed triumph of European intellect. Adam Smith is crowned the sole, original inventor of economic science. We are told that his conceptualization of the free market was a spontaneous, miraculous spark of Scottish genius that permanently altered the trajectory of human history. But if you actually dig into the historical archives, if you look at the massive, highly complex commercial empires of the Islamic world, and if you read what Arab scholars were writing while Europe was still burning witches at the stake, that beautiful, isolated narrative of Western genius completely collapses. To find the true, original author of modern economics, we have to travel back in time, over 400 years before Adam Smith ever picked up a pen. We have to completely leave the damp, intellectually isolated universities of Northern Europe and travel to the glittering, highly advanced commercial hubs of 14th century North Africa. In the year 1377, a brilliant Arab historian, sociologist, and philosopher named Ibn Khaldun sat down to write a massive, unprecedented analysis of human civilization. He was trying to figure out why empires rise, why they grow wealthy, and why they inevitably collapse. He titled his masterpiece the Muqaddimah, which translates to the Introduction. This was not just a book about kings and wars. It was the absolute first scientific analysis of human economics ever written. Inside the pages of the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun completely outlined the exact laws of modern capitalism that Adam Smith would claim to invent 4 centuries later. Let us look at the absolute cornerstone of Adam Smith's legacy, the division of labor, the famous pin factory. In 1377, Ibn Khaldun wrote a chapter specifically detailing how human wealth is generated. He argued that a single human being, living in isolation, cannot possibly provide for his own basic needs. He explicitly details the exact mechanism of divided labor, using the example of a loaf of bread. Khaldun writes that for a single man to eat a piece of bread, he needs the labor of the farmer who grew the wheat. But the farmer cannot grow the wheat without the blacksmith who forged the iron plow, and the carpenter who built the wooden handle. And once the wheat is grown, it requires the labor of the miller to grind it, and the baker to fire it. Khaldun explicitly states that through cooperation and the division of specific tasks, human beings produce a surplus of wealth that is vastly greater than what they could ever produce individually. He was mapping the exact conceptual framework of the division of labor, explaining the precise mechanics of surplus value and cooperative production, 400 years before Adam Smith wrote a single word about a pin factory. But Khaldun did not stop there. He went on to perfectly describe the mechanisms of supply and demand. Centuries before European economists understood how markets naturally regulate prices, Ibn Khaldun observed the massive, bustling trade markets of cities like Cairo and Tunis. He wrote that when a city grows in population, the demand for basic necessities like food and building materials skyrockets. Because the demand is high, the prices naturally rise. Conversely, he noted that in rural, sparsely populated areas, the demand for these same goods is incredibly low, so the prices remain cheap. He even analyzed how the prices of luxury goods fluctuate based on the specific wealth and disposable income of the urban elite. He understood that prices were not dictated by kings or divine right, but by the cold, mathematical reality of supply and human desire. And perhaps most devastating to the Adam Smith myth, Ibn Khaldun mathematically proved the exact relationship between taxation and economic growth. In the 20th century, American economists popularized the concept known as the Laffer curve. It is the conservative economic principle that if you tax businesses too heavily, they will stop producing, which actually results in the government collecting less tax revenue overall. But if you lower taxes, business booms, and the government ultimately collects more money from a wealthier population. This is considered a hallmark of modern, Western free market theory. But in the Muqaddimah, written in the 14th century, Ibn Khaldun dedicates an entire section to this exact phenomenon. He writes that at the beginning of an empire, taxes are incredibly low, but the total revenue collected is massive because business is thriving. But as the empire grows old and greedy, the government raises taxes on the merchants and farmers. Khaldun explicitly proves that these high taxes crush the incentive to work. The businesses fail, production stops, and the total tax revenue collected by the government plummets. He authored the absolute mathematical proof that lower taxes stimulate economic growth, and he did it during the Middle Ages. Ibn Khaldun had constructed the exact philosophical and mathematical architecture of modern capitalism. He defined the value of labor, the regulatory power of supply and demand, and the danger of excessive government taxation. So, a massive, terrifying question emerges for the defenders of the Western economic myth. If the absolute foundational blueprint for the free market was written in a 14th century Arabic manuscript in North Africa, how did those exact same concepts suddenly become the original cornerstone of Adam Smith's philosophy in 18th century Scotland? To answer that terrifying question, we have to look away from the romanticized image of the misty Scottish Highlands. We have to look at the massive, highly organized, and deliberately obscured intellectual trade networks of the 17th and 18th centuries, and the true, hidden engine of the European Enlightenment. You were taught that the Scottish and French Enlightenments were closed intellectual loops. You were told that men like Adam Smith, David Hume, and Francois Quesnay sat in their ornate libraries in Edinburgh and Paris, reading only the ancient Greeks and each other. The Western narrative violently insists that the economic awakening of the 18th century was a purely, exclusively European conversation. But the buried record reveals a completely different, highly interconnected reality. 18th century Europe was not an isolated bubble. It was absolutely obsessed with the economic power of the East. To understand how Ibn Khaldun's work reached the desk of a Scottish philosopher, you have to understand the geopolitical reality of the Mediterranean. For centuries leading up to the Enlightenment, the undisputed economic superpower of the world was not England, and it was not France. It was the massive, highly complex Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans controlled the most lucrative trade routes on the face of the earth. They managed a vast, multi-continental economy with a level of sophistication that European kings could only dream of. And the European powers knew this. European diplomats, merchants, and scholars were aggressively dispatched to cities like Istanbul, Cairo, and Aleppo. Their mission was not just to buy silk and spices. Their mission was intellectual extraction. They were desperately trying to figure out how the Ottoman economic machine functioned. They were actively acquiring, copying, and translating Arabic and Ottoman manuscripts on statecraft, governance, and trade. And if you were an Ottoman diplomat, an imperial bureaucrat, or a scholar operating in the 16th, 17th, or 18th centuries, there was one specific book that was considered the absolute, undisputed gold standard of political and economic science. It was Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. Khaldun's masterpiece was not a forgotten, dusty scroll. It was the active, heavily referenced playbook of the Ottoman elite. Ottoman historians and statesmen praised it as the ultimate guide to understanding how taxation, labor, and markets dictate the rise and fall of empires. Because the Muqaddimah was the absolute centerpiece of Eastern economic thought, it inevitably caught the attention of the massive European translation machine. By the late 17th century, European Orientalists were actively cataloging the works of Islamic scholars. In 1697, a massive French encyclopedia called the Bibliothèque Orientale, compiled by Barthélemy d'Herbelot, was published in Paris. It specifically profiled Ibn Khaldun, explicitly introducing his unparalleled genius in sociology and history to the European intellectual elite. The concepts of the Muqaddimah began to silently, pervasively, leak into the academic bloodstream of Europe. Translations of Ottoman political treatises, which were heavily, explicitly based on Ibn Khaldun's exact economic models, were circulating through the aristocratic salons of Paris and London. So, where was Adam Smith while the economic blueprints of the Islamic world were actively flooding into the libraries of Western Europe? The Western textbook wants you to believe that Adam Smith was completely isolated from this Eastern influence. They want you to believe that when he published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, inventing the concepts of the division of labor and the free market, he did it entirely out of his own original, unmatched Scottish intellect. But the physical and academic reality of Adam Smith's life destroys that myth completely. Adam Smith did not invent modern economics while sitting alone in Scotland. The absolute turning point of his intellectual life occurred in 1764, when he left Britain and traveled to the epicenter of the European intellectual world, France. Smith spent months in Paris, deeply embedded in a highly specific, radical circle of French economists known as the Physiocrats. Led by men like Francois Quesnay, the Physiocrats were the absolute cutting-edge economic thinkers of Europe. They were aggressively arguing against the old, heavy-handed government control of mercantilism. They were the ones who coined the famous phrase, laissez-faire, meaning, let it be, arguing that markets should be free from government interference. Adam Smith sat in their salons. He absorbed their theories. He engaged in massive, late-night debates with them. He admitted that their system of political economy was the closest thing to the truth that had ever been published. But where did the French Physiocrats get their ideas? The Physiocrats were openly, undeniably obsessed with Eastern economic models. They frequently praised the governance and agricultural policies of China and the Islamic East, holding them up as vastly superior to the stagnant, corrupt systems of European monarchy. The French intellectual elite of the 18th century had direct, unrestricted access to the massive royal libraries of Paris, which were currently overflowing with the translated manuscripts extracted from the Ottoman Empire. The Physiocrats were breathing the exact intellectual air that had been heavily saturated by the imported concepts of Ibn Khaldun. The ideas of natural market regulation, the destructive nature of heavy taxation, and the fundamental value of human labor were already established Eastern doctrines that the French were actively weaponizing against their own king. Adam Smith did not invent the free market. He took massive, detailed notes from the French Physiocrats, who were themselves heavily synthesizing the imported, highly advanced economic models of the East. When Smith returned to Scotland and spent the next 10 years writing The Wealth of Nations, he was not pulling a new science out of thin air. He was synthesizing, translating, and westernizing a vast, pre-existing economic architecture that had been moving silently across the Mediterranean for centuries. But the defenders of the Western economic myth will furiously argue that this is just circumstantial. They will argue that even if Smith was exposed to Eastern ideas through the French, he must have independently formalized the exact mechanisms of capitalism. They will argue that two brilliant minds, separated by 400 years, just miraculously came up with the exact same, highly specific economic theories. But the buried record does not rely on circumstantial evidence. It relies on the undeniable, text-to-text philosophical mirroring. When you strip away the 18th century English prose and look at the actual structural logic of The Wealth of Nations and place it side by side with the 14th century Arabic text of the Muqaddimah, the illusion of Adam Smith's original genius completely evaporates. Let us look at the theory of labor value. Adam Smith is universally credited with inventing the labor theory of value. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith writes that labor was the first price, the original purchase money that was paid for all things. He argues that the true wealth of a nation is not its gold or its silver, but the sum total of the productive labor of its people. This was considered a massive, revolutionary breakthrough in Western thought. It completely destroyed the old mercantilist idea that wealth was just hoarded metal. But 400 years earlier, in the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun wrote the exact same revolutionary concept, using the exact same logical progression. Khaldun explicitly states, "Everything that comes into the world requires human labor." He writes that even if a man finds gold or silver in a mine, it is absolutely worthless without the human labor required to extract it, refine it, and mint it. Khaldun definitively concluded that the only true measure of wealth, the absolute foundation of all value in a society, is human labor. Smith did not invent the labor theory of value. He simply repeated it, and the theft goes even deeper into the mechanics of the market. Smith is famous for his concept of the invisible hand, the idea that individuals pursuing their own selfish profit inadvertently benefit the entire society by creating a thriving, competitive market. He argued that government interference only disrupts this natural, beneficial balance. But Ibn Khaldun had already mapped this exact psychological and economic phenomenon. Khaldun wrote extensively about how the desire for profit is the absolute engine of human civilization. He argued that when merchants are free to pursue their own wealth without the threat of government confiscation or excessive taxation, they naturally import the exact goods the city needs. They naturally lower prices to compete with one another, and they naturally create a surplus of wealth that lifts up the entire society. Khaldun explicitly warned against the state engaging in commerce. He proved that when the government tries to act as a merchant, or when it tries to fix prices, it completely destroys the natural competition of the market, leading to monopolies, scarcity, and economic collapse. The Western world holds up Adam Smith as the ultimate, foundational architect of modern free market capitalism. His philosophy directly built the British Empire. His words are physically echoed in the boardrooms of every major corporation and the halls of every Western government. But the intellectual framework that allowed Smith to conceptualize those ideas was not born in Scotland. It was entirely, fundamentally Islamic. Smith took the finished, polished economic blueprints from the brilliant mind of a North African Muslim scholar, applied them to the burgeoning industrial landscape of 18th century Britain, and completely erased the original author. He never cited Ibn Khaldun. He never credited the massive intellectual debt he owed to the translation networks of Paris and the sophisticated economic models of the Ottoman Empire. He packaged centuries of brilliant Islamic economic analysis, slapped an English title on it, and handed it to a European continent that was desperate to dominate global trade. And the European academic establishment, eager to claim the invention of modern wealth as an exclusively Western triumph, accepted it without question. They took this massively appropriated economic framework and built an entire ideological fortress around it. They used the genius of Adam Smith to prove that the Western mind was inherently more rational, more mathematically advanced, and more naturally suited for global dominance than the backward civilizations of the East. They built the modern global economy on a stolen foundation. But how did this massive intellectual cover-up survive for over 200 years? How did the West successfully bury the true father of capitalism, even when the original Arabic manuscript was sitting right there in their own archives? To understand how this massive intellectual cover-up survived, you have to look at the violent rewriting of the global historical narrative during the age of European empire. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as the British and French empires began to aggressively colonize the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, they needed a powerful psychological weapon. They needed a historical narrative that justified their brutal economic conquests. They needed to prove to themselves, and to the people they were subjugating, that the Western mind was biologically, culturally, and intellectually superior. To justify the horrific violence of economic colonialism, the West had to construct a myth that the East was fundamentally irrational, incapable of managing its own wealth, and driven entirely by mysticism and emotional chaos. They had to claim that the concepts of logic, free trade, and economic science were the exclusive, copyrighted property of the white European male, and that meant completely erasing the Islamic roots of modern capitalism. If the British Empire admitted that Adam Smith, the absolute father of Western wealth and the ideological architect of their global trade network, had actually built his entire economic fortress on the intellectual architecture of a 14th century Arab Muslim, the entire justification for European economic supremacy would instantly shatter. They could not claim to be bringing the light of civilization and commerce to the backward East if they were forced to admit that the East had actually taught them how to calculate value in the first place. So, the Western academic establishment executed a massive, deliberate campaign of historical amnesia. When Western historians wrote the definitive history of economic thought, they deliberately drew a straight, unbroken line from the ancient Greeks, completely skipped over the 700 years of the Islamic Golden Age, and landed directly in the lap of the Scottish Enlightenment. They took Ibn Khaldun, a man who had literally authored the mathematical laws of supply and demand, the division of labor, and the Laffer curve 4 centuries before Europe figured them out, and they deliberately marginalized him. They relegated the Muqaddimah to the status of an obscure, exotic, Oriental history book, completely stripping it of its massive, undeniable status as the foundational text of global economic science. But the West did not just steal the mathematics of the free market, they stole the physical mechanics of the economy, and then they violently corrupted them to serve their own imperial agenda. Look at how the Western mind twisted the Islamic blueprint. In Ibn Khaldun's original 14th century masterpiece, the free market is described as a fragile, holistic ecosystem. Khaldun explicitly warns that the division of labor and the pursuit of profit must be balanced with intense ethical responsibility. He warns that when a ruling class becomes too obsessed with hoarding wealth, when they use their power to monopolize markets and crush the working class with taxes and price fixing, the civilization will inevitably, violently collapse. He designed his economic theory as a massive warning system to protect human society from its own greed. In Adam Smith's 18th century Western version, the ethical warnings are largely stripped away in practice, replaced by the cold, mechanical justification of the invisible hand. The Western powers did not use the division of labor to create a harmonious, balanced society. They used it to build the brutal, soul-crushing factories of the Industrial Revolution, where human beings were reduced to mindless cogs in a machine, repeating a single motion for 14 hours a day. They did not use the concept of free trade to uplift humanity. They used it to justify the violent extraction of resources from India, Africa, and the Americas. This is the ultimate, sickening metaphor for the wealth of nations heist. The West took the profound, brilliant, harmony-driven economic science of the Islamic Golden Age, stripped it of its moral soul, and weaponized it. They took the mechanics of the free market an idea originally designed to explain the rise and fall of civilizations, and used it to build a ruthless, global financial empire where the enlightened European had the divine right to extract the wealth of the uncivilized globe. We build massive marble statues to the fathers of modern capitalism. We sit in university classrooms and nod along as economics professors praise the unique, unparalleled genius of Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment. We are told that the West alone crawled out of the darkness and invented the math of human prosperity. But the modern global economy was not born in isolation. It was entirely awakened, shaped, and permanently defined by a translated Arabic manuscript. Adam Smith is only considered the original architect of the free market because the Western world deliberately decided to stop reading the bibliography of human history. The birth of modern economics was not a spontaneous European miracle. It was a massive, highly successful intellectual heist. The West didn't invent the engine of capitalism. They simply stole the blueprints from the Islamic world, smashed the original name off the side, and then convinced the rest of the planet that they had invented the very concept of wealth. Everything you just heard is documented. The massive, undeniable presence of the Muqaddimah in the libraries of the Ottoman elite is a historical fact. The active, aggressive extraction and translation of Eastern political treatises by French and English scholars is physically recorded in the archives of Paris and London. The exact, step-by-step philosophical mirroring between Ibn Khaldun's 14th century analysis of labor, supply, demand, and taxation, and Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, is sitting right there on the pages. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why is the true father of modern economics deliberately kept out of your textbook? If this completely shattered how you see the free market and the myth of Western economic supremacy, share it with someone who needs to hear this. The buried record demands the truth. Subscribe, and we will